The demographic driver we're going to look at now is that of migration, and this will enable you to answer the third essay topic: what role will international migration play in 21st century demographic change? So let's look at the kind of migration we've had, particularly in the 20th century, and how it might change going forward. One of the really big international movements that's dominated recently is movement of human capital or migrants from the south, particularly Asia, Africa, Latin America, into the Northern Hemisphere. And this in particular has been compensating for the lack of workers that we find in Europe, to a certain extent, in North America, as their populations aged. And this comes out of the argument around the so-called demographic deficit, which is where we have not enough people of working age to compensate for the growing number of older dependents. And it's seen that these demographic shifts are going to affect economies and labour markets, and that the labour supply in particular is going to be very vulnerable. If we just consider two very different but important world economies, for example, Germany's workers are predicted to fall from 64 to 41 million by 2050, and interestingly, China's will also shrink by about a fifth. We'll come back to China in a minute, but let's just focus on Europe. There are particular concerns about Europe where the structural ageing of the European population is going to lead to this so-called demographic deficit, whereby the population of working age will be insufficient to support the increasing proportion of older dependents. And we can see this to a certain extent here in this diagram of OECD labour supply. What we've mapped here is the number of people entering the labour market, that is the number who are aged, say, 20 to 24, vis-a-vis the number who will be leaving the labour market, those over 60. And you can see that round about here, there's a crossover. And this actually takes into account the predicted migrant flows. So even with the predicted migrant flows, the OECD is still suggesting that there will be a downfall in people of working age due to the demographic changes that are going to occur in many OECD countries. For example, here, if we look at the UK, we have benefited from migrants from our former colonies, from Asia, from Africa in particular. The US, it has very much drawn on migration from South America. But remember, I talked about the downfall that was going to occur in China's working force. And some people are arguing that the skills of the world will increasingly be drawn into China as its government will need these skills in order to drive its economy forward. So what would be the implications of this? I think it's increasingly recognised that migration can have a strong and lasting impact both on population growth and structure. This is due to the relatively young age structure and thus potential of immigrants. And immigration is thus seen by governments as having the potential to prevent population decline, maintain the size of the labour force, and thus the support ratio, or counter the demographic deficit, and thereby slow the ageing of populations. And the impact of this is seen to have both short and long-term implications. Now, some people argue that there is a direct impact of migration on future fertility increases, on population size, and on direct labour replacement, simply through increasing the working age population. But while immigration may in the short term achieve immediate increases in the total fertility rate, for example, and thereby population growth and future labour market contribution, other people argue that these are unlikely to achieve full replacement level, that they probably will be unsustainable over the longer term, and of course they could indeed eventually contribute to a worsening of the demographic deficit as the total fertility rates of the immigrant population will fall and the immigrants themselves will age.